My name is Sarah, and for 30 years every sacrifice I made was to give my daughter, Emily, the life I never had. When she married into the wealthy Vance family, I thought my work was finally done. I arrived at their sprawling Virginia estate, my heart ready to burst with pride, expecting a loving embrace. Instead, my own daughter and her cruel mother-in-law smiled politely and led me to my guest suite for the visit, a cold, dusty corner of an old barn. They thought I'd swallow my pride and endure the humiliation. They thought I was just a quiet, simple woman they could hide away. They're about to learn that when you try to bury someone with roots as deep as mine, you've just given them fertile ground to grow. Follow my story to see how I take back my dignity and tear their perfect world down from the inside. Backhand index pointing down. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment what you think they deserve. The taxi turned through a set of imposing iron gates, and my breath caught in my throat. The Vance estate wasn't just a house. It was a statement. A long, winding driveway, flanked by perfectly spaced oak trees, led to a sprawling brick mansion that looked like it had been plucked from the cover of a magazine. For a moment, my heart swelled with a fierce, complicated pride. This was my daughter Emily's new life. I paid the driver, pulling my worn but sturdy suitcase onto the crushed stone drive. Before I could even take a step, the heavy front door swung open. There was Emily, looking elegant in a cream-colored cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. Her hair, which I'd once braided every morning, was now styled in a way that looked expensive and untouchable. "Mom," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. She gave me a brief, stiff hug that smelled of a perfume I didn't recognize. "Emily, sweetheart, look at you. And this place, it's incredible," I said, my voice genuine. "It's something, isn't it?" A man appeared behind her, sliding his arm around her waist. David Vance, taller than I remembered from the wedding, with a practiced, easy smile that felt more like a negotiation tactic. "Sarah, welcome. Glad you could finally make it out." "It's lovely to see you, David." As if summoned, a third figure emerged from the shadows of the grand foyer. Eleanor Vance, David's mother, was a woman sculpted from ice. Her silver hair was coiled perfectly, her eyes the color of a winter sky. She didn't smile. She assessed. Her gaze flickered from my sensible walking shoes to my practical coat and finally to my face, lingering for a moment as if checking for flaws. "Sarah," she said, her voice crisp and cool, "Emily has told us so much about you." The words were polite, but the tone suggested that none of what she'd heard had been impressive. In that one look, I felt my status shift from mother of the bride to small-town curiosity. I clutched the handle of my suitcase a little tighter. The gilded cage had opened its door, and I had just walked in. "Let us give you the grand tour," David announced, a sweep of his hand encompassing the cavernous living room with its cathedral ceilings and a fireplace large enough to stand in. They led me through a series of immaculate, soulless rooms. The formal dining room, the gleaming kitchen with its 3 ovens, the sunroom overlooking a vast, manicured lawn. Everything was perfect. Everything was beige. I kept waiting for them to lead me up the grand, curving staircase to a guest room, but the tour continued back toward the rear of the house. We stepped out onto a stone patio. Beyond the pristine lawn and a dormant rose garden, a large, weathered barn stood silhouetted against the afternoon sky. It was a classic American structure of graying wood and a slightly sagging roofline, a stark contrast to the polished perfection of the main house. "We've been so busy with renovations, we just haven't had a spare room finished," Emily began, her voice taking on a falsely bright tone as she refused to meet my gaze. "So we got creative. We've fixed up a little guest suite for you in the barn. It's more private this way, you know." My own smile felt frozen on my face. Private. We walked across the lawn, the damp chill of the late autumn air seeping into my bones. David unlatched the heavy sliding door, and it groaned open, revealing a dusty, cavernous space that smelled of hay, earth, and neglect. In one corner, a sad attempt had been made. A metal frame cot was made up with thin-looking blankets. Beside it stood a small table with a lamp, and a humming, glowing orange portable heater that did little to combat the cavernous cold. A faded floral screen was propped up to provide the illusion of a separate room. A thick, ancient spiderweb, a work of art in its own right, connected a ceiling beam to the window frame. Humiliation washed over me in a cold, sickening wave. I, who had scrimped and saved, who had worked my fingers to the bone landscaping other people's yards so my daughter could have the best, was being put out to pasture like an old mare. "It's rustic," I managed to say, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "It's got character," David boomed, clearly pleased with the arrangement. Emily just stood there, staring at a spot on the dusty floor. Her silence the most painful blow of all. Sleep was impossible. The thin blanket was no match for the deep, damp cold that radiated from the barn's floorboards, and the little space heater was fighting a losing battle. I lay on the lumpy cot, fully dressed in a sweater and socks, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls. Sounded like a lonely ghost. Sometime after midnight, I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path outside. Voices carried clearly on the cold night air. It was David and his mother, Eleanor, walking back from the garage. "Honestly, David, I don't know why she had to visit for 2 whole weeks," Eleanor said, her voice a sharp, cutting whisper. "It's an imposition." "I know, Mother." Emily insisted, David replied, his tone weary. "We'll keep her out of the way." Putting her out here was a stroke of genius, if I do say so myself. It's fitting, don't you think? The gardener, back amongst the dirt and tools. I heard Emily's voice then, faint and hesitant, from the direction of the house's back door. "That's not funny, David. She's my mother." "Oh, relax, darling," Eleanor cooed back, her voice dripping with condescension. "We're just having a bit of fun. Don't be so sensitive. Now come inside, you'll catch a chill." The back door clicked shut, followed by their muffled laughter. I lay there in the oppressive dark, the silence they left behind ringing in my ears. The cold I felt was no longer from the air. It was a deep internal freeze. It wasn't just that they looked down on me. It was that they were turning my own daughter against me, and she was letting them. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't even family. I was an embarrassment to be managed, a problem to be hidden away in a barn. And my daughter, my Emily, was their accomplice. The next few days established a brutal routine. I was a ghost haunting the edges of their lives. In the mornings, I'd see them through the barn window, getting into their luxury cars to go to the country club or on shopping trips. I was never invited. "Oh, Mom, we were going to ask you," Emily would say later, her eyes flitting away. "But we thought you'd be bored. It's all just stuffy people." The excuse was as flimsy as the screen separating my cot from the rest of the barn. On the 3rd day, Eleanor approached me while I was standing by the dormant rose garden, my hands in my pockets. "Sarah," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "Since you have such a green thumb, perhaps you could find time to tidy up these beds a bit. They've gotten so out of hand." It wasn't a request. It was a command. She was assigning me chores. Me, a retired landscape architect who had once designed gardens for botanical societies, was being asked to pull weeds like a day laborer. I wanted to tell her where she could put her prize-winning hydrangeas, but I saw Emily watching from the sunroom window, a worried pleat in her brow. So I just nodded. "Of course, Eleanor. Happy to help." My conversations with Emily were stilted and strange. She talked about people I didn't know. The Chadwicks, the Vanderbilts of their little social pond. She talked about charity auctions and ski trips to Aspen. Her words littered with brand names and the anxieties of a woman desperate to fit in. She was a stranger, performing a role in a play I hadn't been given the script for. She was learning a new language, and in the process, she had completely forgotten how to speak to me. I was becoming invisible, my presence fading until all they saw was an inconvenient relic from a life they wanted to forget. On Saturday, Eleanor hosted a dinner party. The driveway filled with Mercedes and BMWs. Laughter and music spilled from the main house, a warm bubble of light and privilege. I, of course, was not to be a part of it. "It's just a formal thing, Mom." All of David's boring business partners, Emily had explained earlier, handing me a tray with a sandwich and a bottle of water. You can just relax and make yourself comfortable in the barn tonight. The humiliation was a physical thing now, a constant dull ache behind my ribs. But I didn't stay in the barn. As darkness fell, I crept out and found a spot in the deep shadows of the porch, hidden behind a large boxwood hedge. From there, I could see into the brightly lit dining room. They were all seated around the long, polished table, laughing and drinking wine. Eleanor was holding court, regaling the table with a story. I couldn't hear the words, just the cadence of her voice and the appreciative chuckles of her guests. Then, I saw her gesture vaguely in my direction towards the barn. One of the men at the table, a portly man with a red face, threw his head back and roared with laughter. And then I saw it. The thing that broke the final thread of hope in my heart. My daughter, Emily, smiled at the joke. It was a tight, practiced smile, the kind you give when you want to be included. Then she picked up her wine glass, took a delicate sip, and laughed along with them. A soft, tinkling laugh that sounded completely alien. She was laughing at a joke made at my expense. Her mother. I shrank back into the shadows, the chill of the night air doing nothing to cool the sudden hot fury that surged through me. The pain was still there, a great gaping wound. But beneath it, something else was taking root. Something hard and sharp and patient. They thought I was a meek little woman who would sit quietly in a barn and accept her place. They thought I would endure any humiliation for a few scraps of affection from my daughter. They were wrong. Watching my daughter laugh at my degradation wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. The sun rose on a world that looked exactly the same, but for me, everything had changed. The ache in my chest from the dinner party had cooled overnight, hardening into something solid and heavy like a river stone. I wasn't leaving. Not yet. The thought of packing my bag and slinking away in defeat was more humiliating than the barn itself. They wanted me to be a weak, weeping old woman. I would not give them the satisfaction. I made a decision, standing there in the cold morning light. I would stay. I would smile. I would be the meek, helpful mother-in-law they thought I was. And I would watch. That morning, I put on the old gardening gloves Eleanor had left for me and went to work on the neglected rose beds. But as my hands worked the soil, my mind was busy. For the first time I looked at the entire estate not as a guest, but as the landscape architect I had been for 40 years. The design was all wrong. It was a landscape built to impress, not to be enjoyed. Expensive Japanese maples were planted where they'd get scorched by the afternoon sun. Drainage was poor near the foundation. It was a rookie's design, all flash and no substance. Like its owners. My eyes kept drifting to the barn. My prison. But now I saw it differently. I walked its perimeter, running my hands over the weathered wood. The foundation was hand-laid fieldstone, the kind you don't see after 1850. The main support beams, visible from the inside, were hand-hewn, with joinery I hadn't seen since my university textbooks. This structure wasn't just old, it was ancient, had a story. And I had a feeling its story was the key to my own. Eleanor, I'm just heading into town to pick up some proper compost for these roses, I announced cheerfully a few days later. The soil is terribly depleted. She gave me a dismissive wave. Fine, fine. Don't be long. The idea of me running errands reinforced her image of me as the help. Perfect. Willow Creek's small town center was a charming collection of brick storefronts. I went to the hardware store first. The owner was a man in his 70s with flour-dusted overalls and kind eyes. Just visiting my daughter up at the old Miller place, I said as he rang up a bag of peat moss. His eyes lit up with recognition. Oh, the Miller estate. Shame what happened there. That family had it for generations. The Van Cess, they're a different sort. He leaned in conspiratorially. Paid cash for the whole thing. There was some talk at the time. Folks felt the county pushed the sale through awful fast. But money talks, you know. I suppose it does, I said, my heart starting to beat a little faster. My next stop was the town library. I told the librarian I was researching colonial-era gardens for a personal project. She was delighted to help, pointing me toward the local archives. I spent 2 hours poring over dusty maps and town records. I found the original land grant for the Miller farm. The plot was extensive, the diagrams detailed. I took several discreet photos with my phone. The whispers were starting to form a coherent sentence, and I was beginning to understand the language of this town's secrets. My new hobby of tending the gardens gave me the perfect excuse to be outside, observing everything. I was on my hands and knees, clearing a thick, overgrown hedge that bordered the back of the property, when my trowel struck something hard. Not a rock. It was metal. Curious, I dug around it, my fingers pulling away years of dirt and tangled roots. It was a small bronze disc set into a concrete cylinder buried in the ground. A surveyor's mark. It was old, weathered, but the insignia of the U.S. Geological Survey was still faintly visible. I knew exactly what it was. A legal point of reference, unmovable. That night, back in the cold solitude of the barn, I fired up my laptop. The Wi-Fi signal was weak, but it was enough. I pulled up the county's public land registry and the photos of the old Miller plot I'd taken at the library. I spent hours cross-referencing the old map with the current satellite images and the official Vance property deed. And there it was. Discrepancy. According to the old maps, anchored by the location of that surveyor's mark, the Miller plot had a small, protected corner designated for a historical structure. On the new Vance deed, that corner was simply absorbed into the main property. The boundary line had been subtly, almost imperceptibly, redrawn. It was a small change on paper, but on the ground it meant everything. They hadn't just bought the land. They had swallowed its history. The surveyor's mark proved something was wrong. Now I needed to prove what was there. My gaze went up to the hayloft. It was the one part of the barn I hadn't explored, a place of shadows and forgotten things. The next afternoon, when the entire family was out, I found a rickety ladder and pulled myself up into the loft. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from a grimy window. It was filled with junk, broken furniture, old farming equipment, and stacks of rotting canvas. In the farthest corner, half buried under a pile of burlap sacks, was a small, rotted leather chest. The hinges crumbled as I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of what had once been velvet, was a rolled-up tube of oilcloth. My hands trembled as I untied the fragile string and carefully unrolled it on the dusty floor. It wasn't a blueprint for a barn. The script was elegant, archaic. At the bottom it read, "The Willow Creek Trading Post, ESD 1758. It was a detailed architectural drawing of a fortified trading post, complete with a main hall, a stockade area, and a stone foundation. I scrambled back to my laptop and pulled up the old Miller plot map. I traced the location of the trading post on the screen, then triangulated it using the surveyor's mark as a reference. It was a perfect match. I was sleeping in a registered pre-Revolutionary War historical landmark. The question burned in my mind, why? Why hide it? Why go to the trouble of altering deeds and burying history? The answer, I knew, had to be about the one thing the Vances valued above all else. My opportunity came by accident. David, rushing out for a golf game, left his leather briefcase in the mudroom. It felt like a monumental risk, but I knew I had to take it. My hands shook as I unclasped the brass clasps. Inside, beneath a sheaf of contracts, was a glossy, professionally bound portfolio. The title was embossed in gold foil. Vance Estates, Phase 2. A new vision for luxury living in Willow Creek. I flipped it open. Page after page of architectural renderings showed a new, sprawling development of soulless McMansions. There was a community pool, a tennis court, and a clubhouse. I looked at the master site plan, my eyes scanning for the location. And then I saw it. The new development was slated for the back half of their property, precisely where the barn stood. A small red X marked its location with the label, Demolition, TBD. My blood ran cold. It all snapped into place. They couldn't get a permit to demolish a historical landmark, so they simply made it disappear from the records. Their multi-million-dollar real estate dream was contingent on destroying the very building they had condemned me to. It wasn't just about hiding their humble mother-in-law. It was about committing fraud to pave the way for their fortune. I closed the briefcase, my mind perfectly clear. The pain in my heart was still there, but it was now a focused, cold anger. They had given me a prison. I would make it their undoing. They had handed me a weapon, and I was finally ready to sharpen it. The blueprints were my secret, my ace in the hole. But a weapon is useless without someone to wield it. I couldn't be the one to step forward. They would dismiss me, discredit me, perhaps even find a way to have me committed. I needed an unimpeachable ally. I needed Mr. Abernathy. From my research at the library, I knew the head of the Willow Creek Historical Society was a passionate, slightly cantankerous man named Arthur Abernathy. I also learned from a gossipy article in the local paper's archives that he and Eleanor Vance had publicly clashed a year ago over her refusal to donate to the Society's preservation fund. She had called it a waste of money on dusty relics. That was all I needed to know. I found my excuse growing right by the barn's foundation, a tough, thorny vine with a few lingering deep crimson blooms. It was a Seven Sisters rose, a rare heritage variety that was notoriously difficult to cultivate. It was my perfect pretext. That afternoon I called the Historical Society. "Mr. Abernathy, please. My name is Sarah Jenkins," I said, my voice soft and slightly hesitant. "I'm staying with my daughter on the old Miller property, and I believe I've found a rather remarkable old rose bush. I was hoping an expert like yourself might be able to identify it for me." His interest was immediate and genuine. "Wait until Wednesday afternoon," I'd told him on the phone. "My daughter and her family will be at the club. We'll have some privacy." Mr. Abernathy arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, a kindly-looking man with a tweed jacket and an air of academic excitement. I led him straight to the rose bush. "Magnificent," he breathed, examining a leaf. "A true survivor. It seems to love this spot," I said, gesturing toward the barn. "It's almost as if it's protecting the foundation." I led him inside, feigning a simple admiration for the old structure. "It's just a drafty old barn, but look at these beams, Arthur. Have you ever seen anything like them?" I watched his eyes trace the lines of the hand-hewn timbers, his expression shifting from polite interest to professional fascination. I pointed out the foundation stones, the mortise and tenon joints, all the little details I knew a historian would recognize. I played the part of the observant amateur, the curious gardener. I let him connect the dots. I did not mention the blueprints. "My dear woman," he said, his voice hushed with reverence as he ran a hand over a wooden peg, "this is no barn. This is a treasure." He vowed to look into the property's records immediately. As he left, I saw in his eyes the determined fire of a man on a mission. The seed was planted. My plan was working faster than I'd anticipated. A few days later, a discreet sedan from the county records office pulled up the driveway. Mr. Abernathy was with the driver. I saw them from my window, walking the property line, consulting a map. Eleanor and David saw them too. That evening they confronted me in the barn. The pretense of politeness was gone. "What was that about, Sarah?" David demanded, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud. "Who was that man?" "You've been snooping around town," Eleanor added, her voice like chipping ice. "We know you have. What are you up to?" I summoned every bit of my resolve and looked at them with wide, innocent eyes. I even managed to produce a small, believable quiver in my lip. "Up to? Hey, I don't know what you mean." That was just Mr. Abernathy, the man from the Historical Society. He was so taken with the old rose bush. He came back to look at some old maps. He was just an old dear, admiring the history of everything around here. I wrung my hands. Was that wrong? I didn't mean to bother anyone. They stared at me, their faces a mixture of suspicion and contempt. I could see the wheels turning in their heads. Could this simple, dowdy woman truly be capable of a scheme? They looked at my worn sweater, my plain face, and my nervous posture, and their arrogance gave me my answer. They couldn't conceive of it. "Just stay out of things you don't understand, Sarah," David said finally, his tone dismissive. "Play with your flowers and leave the important business to us." They left, confident they had put the silly old woman back in her place. Their confidence lasted less than a week. An official-looking van with a state seal on the side rolled up the driveway, and a man in a suit hand-delivered a certified letter. I watched from the barn as Eleanor took it, her face paling as she read the contents. That night, the arguments began. Their voices were hushed and frantic, but the barn walls were thin. "A full historical survey pending review." David's voice was tight with panic. "Abernathy's doing, I know it is. And it's her fault," Eleanor hissed. "She brought him here. Our lawyers say it could tie up the land for years. The investors for Phase 2 are getting nervous." Listening to their panic was sweeter than any music. The State Historic Preservation Office was now involved. A formal inquiry was underway. The weeds I had so carefully tended were now choking their precious development plans. They were trapped, and they knew it. Instead of pausing, they doubled down. It was a classic move of the arrogant and desperate. Create an illusion of unstoppable momentum. Eleanor announced they were hosting a lavish gala right there on the estate grounds. It would be a groundbreaking celebration for Vance Estates, Phase 2. They invited investors, local politicians, and the press. It was a brazen attempt to show everyone that their project was a done deal. A minor bureaucratic inquiry be damned. It was also the most perfect public stage I could have ever wished for. The night before the gala, I took the original blueprints from their hiding place. I photographed them in perfect detail with my phone. Then I made a high-quality copy of the most damning page, the title block and the architectural drawing, at the town library's print shop. I placed the copy in a plain manila envelope. I addressed it to Mr. Arthur Abernathy at the Historical Society. There was no return address. On a small, separate slip of paper, I typed a simple message. "Heard you were looking for this. The party is tomorrow at 7 p.m. I believe the press will be there." I dropped the envelope in a public mailbox in the next town over. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the Vances to walk into it. The night of the gala arrived, cloaking the estate in a cold, clear darkness. From the barn I had a perfect view. Strings of glittering fairy lights were draped from the trees, and glowing tents were erected on the lawn, pulsing with music and catered warmth. The driveway became a slow-moving parade of headlights as the wealthy and influential of Willow Creek arrived in their gleaming chariots. I watched them all, the men in their dark suits, the women in their jewel-toned gowns. And at the center of it all, a beacon of triumphant arrogance, stood Eleanor with David and Emily at her side. Emily was wearing a shimmering silver dress. She looked beautiful and desperately unhappy. They greeted their guests, accepting congratulations, their smiles as bright and fake as the lights strung through the trees. I was, of course, expected to remain hidden. An unspoken command. I didn't mind. I had no desire to be part of their charade. Inside the barn, I had washed my face and put on my nicest traveling blouse, a simple, clean silk shirt. I sat on my cot, a silent observer in the shadows, and waited. The air was electric with anticipation. It was showtime. Around 8 o'clock, David stepped up to a podium set up near the main tent. A hush fell over the crowd as he tapped the microphone. "Friends, investors, neighbors," he began, his voice booming with false sincerity. "Tonight we stand on the precipice of a new era for Willow Creek. A future of progress, of community, of unparalleled luxury." He was in the middle of his self-congratulatory speech when the first set of headlights cut through the darkness at the end of the driveway. They weren't the soft, yellow lights of a luxury sedan. They were the sharp, white beams of official vehicles. A fleet of 3 cars, 2 plain sedans and one with the logo of the state's largest news channel, rolled up the drive and stopped abruptly, cutting off the path. The partygoers turned, murmuring in confusion. The car doors opened. Out stepped Mr. Abernathy, his face set with grim determination. From the second car, two stern-faced individuals in dark suits emerged, their presence radiating authority. And from the news van, a reporter I recognized from the local broadcast, and her cameraman began moving swiftly toward the podium. I had sent the reporter a short, anonymous email that morning. History is about to be made at the Vance estate. You'll want to be there. Panic flickered across David's face. Eleanor moved toward him, her smile a frozen rictus. Mr. Abernathy strode directly to the podium, holding up the blueprint copy I had sent him. "Mr. Vance," he announced, his voice carrying across the stunned silence, "your vision for the future seems to have overlooked the past." He unrolled the print for all to see. This property is home to the original Willow Creek trading post, established in 1758. A structure of profound historical significance. One of the officials stepped forward. "We are from the State Historic Preservation Office," she said coolly. "As of this afternoon, based on incontrovertible evidence, this structure," she pointed directly at my barn, "is a protected state landmark. Any and all development on this parcel is hereby halted indefinitely, pending a full archaeological review." The effect was instantaneous. A wave of shocked gasps swept through the crowd. The investors, who had been smiling moments before, now stared at David and Eleanor with undisguised fury. The reporter was live, her voice a sharp narration of the Vance's public implosion. The gala had devolved into a fiasco. Hours later, after the last of the furious investors and gleeful press had gone, the mansion was dark. I heard the crunch of gravel outside my door. It was flung open, and they stood there, framed in the doorway, their faces masks of pure rage. "You," Eleanor spat, her voice trembling. "This was you." Emily stared at me, her beautiful silver dress looking like a costume, her face streaked with tears and ruined makeup. She took a step forward, her hands clenched into fists. "How could you do that to us?" she shrieked, the sound echoing in the vast, empty barn. "How could you ruin our lives?" I didn't rise from the cot. I simply looked at them, my estranged daughter and the woman who had orchestrated my humiliation. The powerful matriarch now looked small, her son a deflated balloon beside her. For the first time since I'd arrived, I held all the power. And I didn't have to raise my voice. I let a small, calm smile touch my lips. It was a smile of release, of satisfaction, of a deep and settled peace. "Because," I said, my voice steady and clear in the quiet barn, "you asked me to come into your home, and you put me in here, thinking I was worthless. You built this life on a foundation of money and arrogance, and you thought my dignity was cheap enough to be stored away with the spiders and the dust." I finally stood up, my gaze locking with Emily's. "You needed to learn that some things, like history and integrity and a mother's self-respect, are priceless. You forgot the values I taught you, Emily. You let them trade your kindness for a cashmere sweater." I looked from my daughter to Eleanor, my smile unwavering. Mine was never for sale. The next morning I packed my single worn suitcase. The estate was deathly quiet, littered with the debris of the disastrous party, limp napkins, abandoned glasses, and the ghost of yesterday's ambition. I didn't go to the main house to say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. I walked out of the barn, latched the door behind me for the last time, and started down the long, winding driveway. The taxi I had called was waiting for me by the iron gates. I didn't look back at the grand house or the historic barn. I looked forward at the road ahead. The autumn air was crisp and clean and tasted of freedom. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Mr. Abernathy. "The state has approved a preliminary budget for the trading post's restoration. They loved my first suggestion. They want to hire a landscape architect to recreate the authentic heritage gardens. The job is yours if you want it." A real smile, wide and genuine, spread across my face. I was leaving the wreckage of their lives behind, not to retreat, but to build something new, something beautiful and real. A garden of my own, planted on the very ground where I had reclaimed my soul. And just like that, I walked away. I left them with the ruins of their greed and started a new life, tending gardens that heal instead of hide. My revenge was complete, and my dignity was my own again. But now the final chapter is up to you. My phone has been ringing. It's Emily. She sounds broken, apologetic, and is begging for a chance to see me again. So I have to ask you all for advice. Do I answer the call? Comment. Forgive. If you believe a daughter's remorse, no matter how late, deserves a second chance. Comment. Forget. If you believe some betrayals cut too deep and can never be undone. Your comments will decide the true ending of this story. Thank you for reading, and don't forget to like and subscribe.